Ethan Price stared at the untouched glass of bourbon on his desk, the amber liquid catching the faint glow of his office lamp. It had been months since he'd even attempted to drink in moderation. Now it was all or nothing. As an influential tech investor, Ethan was known for his sharp mind and relentless drive. To the outside world, he was still at the top of his game. But behind the success, he was drowning in a pool of grief so deep that every breath felt like a battle. It had been over a year since Oliver, his twin brother, died. People told him the pain would dull over time, but they were wrong. If anything, it grew sharper, cutting deeper into the fabric of his being. Oliver wasn't just a sibling. He was Ethan's other half, the one person who understood him without needing words. They had shared everything, dreams, fears, even their vices. And when Oliver was gone, Ethan felt like half of himself had been ripped away, leaving behind a shell. His hand trembled as it hovered above the glass. He could hear Oliver's voice in his head, taunting him. "You'll never stop, will you? Always chasing something you can't reach." Ethan clenched his fist, pulling his hand back. Drinking wasn't going to bring Oliver back, and it sure as hell wouldn't stop the nightmares. He stood up abruptly, pushing the glass aside as if the mere sight of it offended him. The sleek, modern lines of his office seemed suffocating tonight. The city lights of Chicago blinked through the tall windows, a stark reminder that life went on outside these walls, even if his own had crumbled. Ethan rubbed his tired eyes and sighed, his mind racing back to the phone call that had changed everything. Oliver had overdosed. That's what the police told him. But the autopsy revealed something darker, something that gnawed at Ethan's soul every day. Oliver had been using heavily for months, and Ethan hadn't noticed. They had been so close. How could he have missed it? The guilt was unbearable. Ethan had been too focused on expanding his tech empire, too engrossed in the relentless chase for more money, more power. And now he was paying the price for his negligence. Ethan's phone buzzed, breaking through his spiral of thoughts. He glanced at it, seeing a notification from his assistant, reminding him of tomorrow's meeting with potential investors. He couldn't care less. Meetings, deals, numbers, they all felt meaningless now. For months, he had been spiraling, pretending he was in control while addiction slowly tightened its grip on him. Alcohol was just the beginning. The pills helped him sleep, or at least made him numb enough to escape the pain for a few hours. But when the sun rose, the agony always returned, even more brutal than before. And that's when he saw her. It was an unusually cold afternoon for April when Ethan's car stopped at a red light downtown. He had been avoiding the office, taking long, aimless drives through the city to escape the suffocating emptiness of his apartment. As he gazed out the window, his eyes locked onto a figure sitting against the wall of a nearby building, knees tucked under her chin, face hidden beneath a tangle of brown hair. She couldn't have been more than 25, but life had clearly been rough on her. Her clothes were dirty, her body slumped as though she had given up on everything. Yet there was something in her, something that pulled Ethan in. He didn't know what compelled him to stop. Maybe it was because she reminded him of Oliver, the same lost look he'd seen in his brother's eyes in the weeks before his death. Without thinking, he got out of the car, ignoring the driver's confused glance. The woman didn't look up as he approached, but the sight of her trembling hands and the hollowed-out look in her eyes hit him like a punch to the gut. "You need help," he said, his voice surprising even himself. She finally looked up, her eyes glassy and distant. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. Ethan recognized that look. He had seen it in the mirror too many times. He knelt beside her, lowering his voice. "I can give you a place to stay. Somewhere warm. Some food. No strings attached." At first, there was nothing. Just silence between them, broken by the occasional honk of a car passing by. Then she spoke, her voice rough from disuse. "Why would you do that?" Ethan wasn't sure. Part of him wondered the same thing. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was the gnawing emptiness inside him. Maybe it was the thought that if he could save someone else, it might make up for the fact that he couldn't save Oliver. "Because someone should have helped my brother," he answered. And for the first time in a long while, he felt the weight of the truth slip off his shoulders. The woman studied him for a long moment, something flickering behind her dull eyes. Curiosity, or maybe desperation. Then, Without a word, she nodded. Ethan helped her up and led her to his car. As they drove in silence, he glanced at her again, wondering what secrets she held. He didn't even know her name yet, but something told him they were both about to face a darkness neither of them was prepared for. The car pulled into Ethan's driveway, the vastness of his home a stark contrast to the streets she had come from. But as he opened the door to let her inside, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he had just invited more than just a stranger into his life. The quiet tension in the car was palpable as Ethan drove Sarah, the woman whose name he hadn't even asked yet, back to his home. He glanced at her from the corner of his eye as they pulled up to the house, its cold modern lines looming in the night. It was a stark contrast to her worn-out appearance, and he could tell by the way she fidgeted with her sleeves that she felt out of place. But Ethan didn't say anything. His mind was still processing what he had just done. They stepped inside, the warmth of the house swallowing them whole. Sarah's eyes flickered over the minimalist decor, the towering windows, and the sleek furniture as though she couldn't quite believe she was here. Ethan could sense her unease. It reminded him of the feeling he'd had in those early days after Oliver's death, the discomfort of being in your own skin, as if nothing fit anymore. "Here," he muttered, gesturing toward the living room, where a large leather couch sat facing a floor-to-ceiling window. "You can rest for a bit. I'll get some food." Sarah didn't move at first, just stood there in the foyer, her arms wrapped around herself protectively. Her hesitation felt familiar to Ethan. He knew what it was like to feel like you didn't belong anywhere, not even in your own body. Finally, she nodded and shuffled to the couch, sitting cautiously on the edge as though the leather might burn her skin. Ethan disappeared into the kitchen, trying to push aside the flood of memories that were creeping in. Every move he made reminded him of Oliver, how they'd grown up together, shared everything, and how, in the end, he had failed to notice the growing darkness that swallowed his brother whole. He opened the fridge, pulling out leftovers and whatever else he could find, his hands moving automatically. His mind, however, was far from the kitchen. He couldn't help but wonder why he had brought Sarah here. Was it really just guilt? A desperate attempt to make up for Oliver's death? Or was there something more to it? Some unspoken connection between them that he didn't yet understand? Ethan brought a plate of food into the living room, setting it on the coffee table in front of Sarah. She stared at it for a moment, her hands resting on her knees, fingers tapping nervously. "Eat," he said gently, sitting across from her. Sarah reached for the plate, her movements slow, almost as if she expected it to be taken away from her at any moment. The first bite was cautious, and Ethan watched as she chewed, her eyes flicking up to meet his before darting away again. They sat in silence for what felt like an eternity. Neither of them seemed willing to speak first, the weight of unspoken words hanging in the air between them like a heavy fog. Ethan leaned back, rubbing a hand over his face, exhausted in a way that no amount of sleep could fix. Finally, Sarah broke the silence, her voice rough and low. "Why did you really bring me here?" Ethan's gaze met hers. For a moment, he wasn't sure how to respond. The truth was complicated, tangled in layers of grief, guilt, and a desperate need for redemption. He could feel the walls he had built around himself starting to crack, but he wasn't ready to let them fall, not yet. "I told you," he said quietly. "I wanted to help." Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly, and for the first time since they had met, Ethan saw something other than exhaustion in her face. It was suspicion, mixed with a guarded, hardened edge that spoke of years of survival on the streets. "You don't know me," she said, her voice tightening. "You don't know anything about me. Why take the risk?" Ethan leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees as he stared at the floor. "Because I've been where you are," he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. Maybe not exactly the same place, but close enough. Sarah's expression shifted, softening just a fraction. She set the plate down, her appetite fading as the conversation grew heavier. Ethan could tell she was debating whether or not to trust him. But trust was a fragile thing, and neither of them had much left to give. "I don't need your pity," Sarah said after a long pause, her voice sharper than before. "I've survived on my own this long. I don't need someone coming in and trying to fix me." Ethan nodded, understanding the anger in her words. It was the same anger he had felt when well-meaning friends tried to help him after Oliver's death, offering empty words of comfort and advice that did nothing to fill the gaping hole inside him. "I'm not trying to fix you," Ethan replied, his tone steady but sincere. "I'm just offering you a place to stay. What you do with that is up to you." Sarah's eyes darted to the windows, then back to him. For a moment, she seemed to be weighing her options, her mind calculating the risks. But the exhaustion won out. She slumped back against the couch, the fight draining out of her. "Fine," she muttered, barely audible. Ethan watched her, sensing that this was as close to trust as he was going to get. He stood up, nodding toward the hallway. "There's a guest room down the hall. Clean sheets, towels, whatever you need. Make yourself at home." Sarah didn't move right away, but eventually, she rose from the couch, still holding herself tightly as though she might disappear if she let go. As she walked past him toward the guest room, Ethan couldn't help but feel a strange mix of relief and apprehension. He didn't know what he was getting into, but something told him that bringing Sarah here was just the beginning of something far more complicated than either of them could predict. As Sarah disappeared down the hall, Ethan stood in the empty living room, staring at the space she had just occupied. He wasn't sure what he expected, but the silence that followed felt heavy. He had invited a stranger into his home, but it felt like he had opened the door to something far more dangerous than he could have anticipated. And deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah wasn't just another lost soul. There was something more to her, something he couldn't yet see. And whatever it was, it would change both of their lives in ways they weren't ready for. Ethan woke the next morning with a familiar sense of dread gnawing at him, the kind of weight that settled in your chest before you were fully awake. His first instinct was to reach for the bottle on his nightstand, but he stopped himself, remembering the woman he'd brought into his home the night before. Sarah. He sat up, scrubbing his hands over his face, feeling the dull ache behind his eyes. The house was silent, and for a moment, he wondered if Sarah had left, slipping out in the middle of the night. Maybe she had. Maybe that was for the best. But something told him she was still there. He could feel it, an unspoken tension lingering in the air, thick and heavy. Ethan got up, pulling on a t-shirt as he walked down the hall toward the guest room. The door was closed. He hesitated for a moment, unsure whether he should knock or leave her be. The last thing he wanted was to scare her off, but there was something unsettling about not knowing what was going on behind that door. Finally, he knocked softly. No response. He knocked again, louder this time. "Sarah?" His voice echoed in the empty hallway. After a beat, the door creaked open, just enough for him to see Sarah's face, framed by disheveled hair, her eyes dull but alert. "I'm fine," she muttered, her voice rough and guarded. She didn't open the door any further, and Ethan could see the shadows under her eyes, the kind that spoke of sleepless nights and the weight of too many unspoken thoughts. "Just wanted to check on you," Ethan said, keeping his tone neutral, careful not to push too hard. "If you need anything, food, clothes, just let me know." Sarah's expression didn't change. She looked at him for a moment longer, then nodded slightly before closing the door again. The sound of it shutting was final, like the closing of a chapter Ethan wasn't allowed to read. Ethan stood there for a few seconds, staring at the door. He could feel the distance between them, even though they were just a few feet apart. Two people, both broken in different ways, trying to navigate the unspoken boundaries that kept them from reaching out. Shaking off the sense of rejection, he walked back toward the kitchen, reminding himself that this wasn't about him. Sarah had been on the streets for who knew how long, and trust wasn't something you rebuilt overnight. He didn't expect her to just open up and spill her life story over breakfast. It would take time, if she even stayed. Still, as he stood in the kitchen, brewing coffee, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that there was something different about her. She wasn't just another lost soul drifting through his life. The guarded look in her eyes, the way she held herself, like she was waiting for the world to strike her down again. It was all too familiar. It reminded him of the days after Oliver's death, when he had felt like a ghost walking through his own life, waiting for the next disaster to hit. Ethan poured himself a cup of coffee, the smell filling the kitchen with warmth. He sat at the counter, staring out at the city skyline, wondering what the hell he had gotten himself into. He had never been good at fixing people, least of all himself. So what made him think he could help Sarah? The sound of footsteps behind him snapped him out of his thoughts. He turned to see Sarah standing in the doorway, her arms wrapped around herself as if she was trying to make herself smaller, less noticeable. She looked like she hadn't slept at all, her skin pale, her eyes bloodshot. "Morning," Ethan said cautiously, testing the waters. Sarah didn't respond right away. She just stood there, her gaze flicking around the room, taking in the space as if it was the first time she'd really seen it. After a long moment, she spoke, her voice soft but steady. "Do you have tea?" Ethan blinked, caught off guard by the simple request. "Yeah, sure," he said, standing up and moving to the cabinet. He rummaged around for a moment before finding a box of herbal tea, one of the few things he kept around from his healthier days, back when he thought yoga and green smoothies could save him from his own demons. He set a mug on the counter and filled it with hot water, dropping the tea bag in. Sarah watched him silently, her arms still wrapped around herself like a shield. Ethan handed her the mug, their fingers brushing briefly as she took it. She flinched slightly at the contact but didn't pull away. She brought the cup to her lips, blowing gently on the steam before taking a small sip. For a moment, they stood in silence, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator in the background. "You don't have to stay," Ethan said after a while, his voice quiet. "If you want to go, I won't stop you." Sarah's gaze flicked up to meet his, and for a second, Ethan thought he saw something flash in her eyes. Fear, maybe, or uncertainty. But it was gone just as quickly as it had appeared. "I know," she replied, her voice flat, "but I'm not going anywhere." Ethan nodded, unsure of how to respond. There was something final in the way she said it, like she had made a decision she couldn't take back. It should have reassured him, but instead, it only deepened the strange, uneasy feeling in his gut. They spent the rest of the morning in relative silence. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, nursing her tea, while Ethan busied himself with work emails and phone calls, his mind half on his tasks, half on the woman sitting a few feet away from him. Every now and then, he would glance up to see her staring off into space, lost in thought, her fingers drumming lightly on the table. By midday, the tension in the air had started to ease, just a little. It wasn't much, but it was something, a silent agreement between them. They were both broken, both carrying wounds too deep to heal easily. But for now, they were in the same place, and that was enough. It wasn't until later that evening, after hours of avoiding each other, that Ethan found himself standing outside the guest room door again. He had been about to knock, to ask if she needed anything, but something made him stop. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack, he could see Sarah. She was sitting on the bed, her back to him, staring at something on the wall. Ethan frowned, leaning in closer. It looked like a piece of paper, taped to the wall above the bed. But as his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he realized it wasn't just one piece of paper. It was several. He pushed the door open a little more, just enough to see the whole picture. His heart skipped a beat. There, on the wall, was a makeshift mural of sorts. Photographs, scraps of paper, handwritten notes, all carefully arranged in a chaotic but deliberate pattern. Ethan's eyes darted over the images, trying to make sense of them. Some were pictures of places he didn't recognize. Others were of people, strangers, most of them, but one face stood out among the rest, sending a cold chill down his spine. Oliver. The photograph of his brother was tacked to the center of the wall, surrounded by scribbled notes and what looked like newspaper clippings. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the image, his mind reeling. How did Sarah know Oliver? What was this? Before he could move, Sarah turned around, her eyes locking onto his. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them stretching into something thick and suffocating. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. He knew, without a doubt, that whatever this was, whatever secret Sarah was hiding, it was about to pull them both into something far darker than either of them could have imagined. Ethan stood frozen in the doorway, his pulse racing as he stared at the wall covered in photos and notes, all centered around the image of his dead brother. The air in the room was thick with unspoken words, the silence almost unbearable. Sarah, still sitting on the bed, didn't move. She just watched him, her eyes dark and unreadable. For a moment, Ethan felt like the ground had been pulled out from under him. He had invited Sarah into his home, thinking he could somehow help her, maybe even help himself. But this was something else entirely. The sight of Oliver's face staring back at him from the center of that chaotic mural sent a shiver down his spine. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. How did Sarah know Oliver? Why was his picture on her wall? Was this some kind of sick joke, or had she been planning this from the start? He felt a surge of anger rising in his chest, but beneath it was something else, fear. The kind of fear that makes your skin crawl, that whispers in your ear that you've missed something important, something dangerous. What the hell is this? Ethan finally managed to choke out, his voice harsh in the quiet room. Sarah's expression didn't change. She didn't flinch or look away. Instead, she calmly set her mug down on the nightstand and stood up, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she had been preparing for this moment. "It's not what you think," she said, her voice low and steady, but there was a hint of defensiveness there, like she knew she was walking a very fine line. Ethan's jaw clenched, his hands curling into fists at his sides. He took a step closer, his eyes scanning the wall again, taking in the details. There were notes scrawled in messy handwriting, arrows connecting different pictures, newspaper clippings about overdoses and disappearances. And right in the middle of it all was Oliver. "How do you know him?" Ethan demanded, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and confusion. "Why is he on your wall?" Sarah took a deep breath, her gaze steady but guarded. "I didn't know him personally," she said, her words carefully measured. "Not the way you did. But we crossed paths. A long time ago." Ethan's stomach tightened, a cold wave of dread washing over him. Crossed paths? That was too vague, too convenient. He needed answers, real answers. "What do you mean? You crossed paths? That doesn't explain this." He gestured wildly at the wall, his frustration bubbling over. "You've been in my house for less than 2 days, and already I find this shrine to my brother? What are you doing here, Sarah?" Sarah didn't back down. She held his gaze, her own frustration starting to show. "I didn't plan this," she shot back, her voice rising slightly. "I didn't come here because of Oliver. I came here because I didn't have anywhere else to go." "Then why the wall?" Ethan pressed, his voice sharp. "Why is his picture here? Why are there notes about him?" Sarah's shoulders slumped slightly, the weight of the situation starting to show. She glanced at the wall, then back at Ethan, her voice softening. "Because your brother. He's part of the reason I'm alive." The room went still, those words hanging in the air between them. Ethan's anger wavered, replaced by confusion. He took a step back, his mind struggling to process what she had just said. "What?" His voice was quieter now, more uncertain. "What do you mean?" Sarah hesitated, biting her lip as if she was weighing her next words carefully. For the first time, Ethan saw a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes, something raw and painful. "Look, I didn't know Oliver well," she began, her voice quieter, almost cautious. "But I knew him enough. We met in a recovery group a few years ago. He wasn't like the others. He was different. He didn't judge. He didn't act like he was better than anyone. He was just kind. He was one of the only people who ever listened to me." Ethan's chest tightened at the mention of the recovery group. He had known Oliver had struggled with addiction, but he had never realized how deep it ran. His brother had kept so much hidden, had buried his pain behind layers of smiles and reassurances, and Ethan had been too wrapped up in his own life to notice. Sarah continued, her voice growing softer. "I was a mess back then. I'm still a mess now, but it was worse then. I'd hit rock bottom, and I didn't care if I lived or died. But Oliver, he talked to me. He didn't try to fix me, didn't preach at me. He just listened. And that was enough. For a while, it was enough to keep me going." Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry. The image of his brother that Sarah was painting didn't match the Oliver he had known. It was both comforting and heartbreaking at the same time. To hear that Oliver had been a lifeline for someone when Ethan had failed to be that for him. "But why the wall?" Ethan asked, his voice quieter now, the anger draining from him. "Why all of this?" Sarah hesitated again, her fingers curling into the fabric of her shirt. Because after Oliver died, I couldn't let it go. I started looking into it. I wanted to know what happened to him. I wanted to understand why he didn't make it. And the more I looked, the more I realized I wasn't the only one. Ethan's heart skipped a beat, a cold chill settling in his stomach. What do you mean? There were others, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. People like Oliver, people who were trying to get clean but didn't make it. And it wasn't just bad luck. There was something else, something wrong. I've been trying to figure it out, to connect the dots. That's why the wall is here. It's not just about Oliver. It's about all of them. Ethan felt like the room was spinning, the weight of her words crashing down on him. He had thought he knew the truth about his brother's death, that it had been a tragic accident, the result of a relapse he hadn't seen coming. But now, standing in front of this wall of secrets, he wasn't so sure. Are you saying? Ethan started, his voice trailing off as he struggled to find the right words. Are you saying Oliver was murdered? Sarah didn't answer right away. She looked down at the floor, her jaw clenched. I don't know, she said finally, her voice barely audible, but I think there's more to his death than we were told. I think someone dangerous, was involved. Ethan's head was spinning, his mind racing with possibilities. He had spent so long blaming himself for Oliver's death, for not seeing the signs, for not being there when his brother had needed him most. But now it seemed like there were darker forces at play, forces he hadn't even known existed. What do we do? Ethan asked, his voice tight with a mixture of fear and determination. Sarah met his gaze, her eyes hardening with resolve. We find out the truth. Together. And in that moment, Ethan knew there was no turning back. He had opened the door to something far more dangerous than he had ever imagined, and now he was in it, whether he liked it or not. Enjoying the video? Subscribe to our channel to receive more interesting content. Click the subscribe button and stay updated with the latest news. Ethan leaned back against the wall, his mind reeling from everything Sarah had just said. The words hung heavy in the air. Murder, dangerous, more than we were told. He had spent so long believing Oliver's death had been nothing more than a tragic accident, a dark chapter in the story of addiction. Now, everything felt upside down, like the floor had dropped out from under him. Sarah stood a few feet away, watching him carefully. There was a tension between them now, a strange understanding that whatever happened next, they were in it together. And yet, despite the gravity of the situation, there was still a part of Ethan that resisted. A part of him that wanted to reject this whole theory, to chalk it up to conspiracy or paranoia. You expect me to just believe this? Ethan's voice was tight, on the edge of anger and disbelief. That Oliver didn't just overdose, that someone was involved? You really think there's some kind of cover-up? Sarah crossed her arms, her gaze steady. I know it sounds crazy. I didn't believe it at first either. But look at the pattern. Oliver wasn't the only one. There were others, people who were trying to get clean, people who had made progress, and they all just disappeared or died suddenly. It's too much of a coincidence, don't you think? Ethan shook his head, pacing across the room as the weight of it all settled in his chest. He didn't want to believe her. He didn't want to think that there was something more sinister behind his brother's death. But deep down, the questions that had haunted him since that terrible day were stirring again. The missed calls. The strange voicemail Oliver had left him the night before he died. The fact that Oliver had seemed fine the last time they spoke. Not happy, maybe, but not like he was on the edge of disaster either. Could there really have been more going on? Was there something Ethan had overlooked? Who would even do something like this? Ethan demanded, his voice rough. What's the point? Sarah bit her lip, glancing back at the wall where the photos and notes were pinned. I don't know exactly who yet, but there's something connecting them. There's money involved, I think. Rehab centers, recovery programs. There's big business behind it all. And not everyone plays fair. Ethan stopped pacing, staring at her. Money? The idea was absurd at first, but then it began to sink in. In the world of addiction recovery, there was certainly no shortage of money being funneled into private clinics, rehab programs, and all sorts of initiatives. People in the system were vulnerable, desperate for help, and where there was vulnerability, there were always those ready to exploit it. It's a theory, Sarah continued, her voice quieter now, more measured. I don't have all the answers yet, but I've been following the trails. A few of the people who died had ties to the same rehab center, or had been approached by certain advocates in the recovery community. It's like there's a whole underground network feeding off these people, and when they stop being useful, they disappear. Ethan swallowed hard. His hands were trembling. It wasn't just the implication that Oliver might have been caught up in something dangerous. It was the sudden, overwhelming realization that he had been completely oblivious. While his brother had been fighting for his life, Ethan had been too distracted by work, too focused on his own problems to notice what was really happening. He turned back towards Sarah, his voice low. Why didn't you say something sooner? Sarah looked away, guilt flashing across her face. I didn't know how, and I didn't have enough proof. I've been trying to piece it all together for months, but every time I get close, something stops me. People won't talk. Records disappear. It's like someone's covering their tracks. Ethan exhaled slowly, trying to steady his thoughts. It made sense, in a horrifying way. Addiction was messy, chaotic, and often led to tragic ends. Who would question another overdose? Who would dig deeper when everyone assumed it was just another person who couldn't make it out alive? His mind flashed back to Oliver's funeral. The mourners, the hollow condolences, the whispers about how addiction had claimed yet another victim. Nobody had looked too closely. Nobody had wanted to look closely. And now, maybe they should have. So what do we do? Ethan asked, his voice steadier now. He wasn't sure how he had made the leap, but somewhere between his initial anger and Sarah's explanations, something inside him had shifted. He didn't know if she was right about everything, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't just let this go. Not anymore. Sarah seemed relieved by his change in tone, but there was still hesitation in her eyes. I've been gathering information, connecting the dots where I can, but I need more help. I need someone who can access the stuff I can't. You have connections, resources. You could find out more. Ethan blinked, caught off guard by the sudden shift. He hadn't thought that far ahead yet, but as he looked at Sarah, he realized that this was part of what she had been hoping for all along. Not just answers, but someone to help her find them. I don't even know where to start, he admitted. I don't have any experience with this kind of thing. You don't need experience, Sarah said firmly. You need determination. You need to want the truth. I know you want it, Ethan. I can see it in your eyes. Ethan was silent for a long moment, the weight of her words settling over him. He did want the truth. More than anything. For so long, he had been running from the pain, from the guilt of not being there for Oliver. But now that he was faced with the possibility that something darker had taken his brother from him, he couldn't turn away. Okay, he said finally, his voice quiet but resolute. I'll help, but we do this carefully. No wild guesses, no rushing into things without proof. We find out what really happened to Oliver, and we expose whoever's behind this. Sarah nodded, her expression softening with something like relief. Agreed. We take our time. We're smart about it. Ethan looked at the wall again, his eyes lingering on Oliver's picture. His brother's face, frozen in time, stared back at him, as if waiting for him to finally understand. He couldn't bring Oliver back, but maybe, just maybe, he could find some answers. Maybe he could stop this from happening to someone else. As Ethan turned back towards Sarah, a sense of clarity settled over him. He didn't know where this path would lead, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was doing something that mattered, something that could bring him closer to the truth he had been avoiding for so long. And in that moment, they both knew there was no turning back. The next few days passed in a blur. Ethan and Sarah fell into an uneasy routine, each step filled with a strange blend of urgency and caution. Their shared mission, finding out the truth behind Oliver's death, hung over everything, coloring their conversations and actions. But it was more than just the pursuit of answers. It was a slow unveiling, layer by layer, of who they really were beneath the guarded facades they had built around themselves. Ethan spent hours at his desk, combing through Oliver's old emails and phone records, looking for any hint of the people Sarah had mentioned. names connected to rehab centers, advocates, anyone who might have had a vested interest in Oliver's downfall. His chest tightened each time he saw his brother's name in black and white, the remnants of a life cut short, frozen in time. Sarah, meanwhile, was more elusive. She came and went quietly, avoiding too much direct conversation, as if she were still testing the boundaries of their fragile partnership. She kept working on her wall, adding more photos and notes, connecting threads that only she seemed to understand. One evening, as Ethan sifted through another pile of documents, the frustration mounting inside him like a ticking time bomb, he heard the soft padding of footsteps behind him. He turned to see Sarah standing in the doorway, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "I found something," she said, her voice steady but cautious. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He stood up, pushing the papers aside as Sarah stepped into the room, holding a small, crumpled piece of paper in her hand. She handed it to him without a word. He unfolded it, his eyes scanning the scrawled writing. It was a name, David Hawthorne. Ethan's brow furrowed in confusion. "Who's this?" he asked, looking up at Sarah. She shifted uncomfortably, her eyes flicking away from his. He was someone Oliver mentioned in group a few times. A counselor, supposedly. He worked with a lot of people who were trying to get clean, but something about him never sat right with me. Ethan's stomach churned as he looked at the name again. "Why?" Sarah hesitated, biting her lip as she searched for the right words. "Because the people he worked with? Most of them ended up dead or missing within a year of getting out, including Oliver." Ethan felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. He stared at the name, his mind racing. David Hawthorne. Was this the connection they had been looking for? Or was it just another dead end? Another lead that would lead them nowhere? "We need to find him," Ethan said, his voice harder than he intended. "Talk to him. If this guy had anything to do with Oliver's death, we need to know." Sarah nodded, though there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "He's not going to talk easily. If he's involved in something this big, he'll be careful. We need a plan." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, pacing the room. His heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing with possibilities. He couldn't shake the image of Oliver in those last few months, how he had seemed fine on the surface, but there had always been something lurking beneath, something Ethan had been too blind to see. "What kind of plan?" he asked, his voice tinged with frustration. "I know someone," Sarah said slowly, as if she were weighing every word. "A journalist. He's been digging into the rehab industry for years. He's the one who helped me start connecting the dots in the first place. If anyone can help us, it's him." Ethan stopped pacing, turning to face her. "Can we trust him?" Sarah's gaze was steady. "I trust him more than anyone else I know." That wasn't saying much, but Ethan didn't argue. They were running out of options, and if this journalist could help shed light on whatever was going on, then they had to take the chance. "Okay," Ethan said, his voice firm. "Let's meet him. See what he knows." 2 days later, Ethan and Sarah found themselves sitting in a dimly lit coffee shop, waiting. Ethan was on edge, his leg bouncing under the table as he glanced around the room. It was the kind of place where people went to disappear, tucked away in the corner of a busy street, its windows fogged from the heat inside. Sarah sat across from him, calm but quiet, her eyes scanning the door. Every few minutes, Ethan would catch her glancing at the clock, the tension building between them as the seconds ticked by. "Are you sure he's coming?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah nodded, though there was a hint of uncertainty in her eyes. "He'll be here." Just as the words left her mouth, the door to the coffee shop opened, and a man walked in. He was tall and lean, with sharp features and dark, restless eyes. His clothes were simple, jeans and a dark jacket, but there was an air of quiet intensity about him. He moved with purpose, his gaze sweeping the room before landing on Sarah. Without a word, he made his way over to their table, sliding into the seat beside Sarah. Up close, Ethan could see the lines of exhaustion etched into the man's face, the weariness of someone who had spent too long chasing shadows. "Sarah," the man said, his voice low and gruff. "Good to see you." Sarah nodded, offering a faint smile. "Ethan, this is Greg." "Greg, this is Ethan." Oliver's brother. Greg's gaze flicked to Ethan, and for a moment, the two men sized each other up. There was no handshake, no pleasantries, just a brief nod of acknowledgement before Greg turned his attention back to Sarah. "You said you found something," Greg said, his tone brisk. "What's going on?" Sarah glanced at Ethan, silently urging him to speak. Ethan cleared his throat, the tension in his chest growing tighter. "We found a name. David Hawthorne. He was one of Oliver's counselors, apparently. And according to Sarah, a lot of the people he worked with ended up dead or missing, including my brother." Greg's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Interest, maybe, or recognition. "Hawthorne," Greg muttered, leaning back in his chair. "I've heard that name before. He's been on my radar for a while. Connected to some shady rehab facilities, the kind that bleed money from desperate families. But I've never been able to pin anything on him." Ethan's heart sank. He had hoped for more, something concrete they could latch onto. But Greg's words only confirmed what they already knew. This was going to be harder than they thought. "What do we do?" Sarah asked, her voice steady but urgent. "We can't just let this go." Greg was silent for a long moment, his eyes narrowing as he considered their options. Finally, he leaned forward, lowering his voice. "We need evidence. Something that ties Hawthorne to the deaths. If we can get that, we can blow this wide open." "And how do we get that?" Ethan asked, his frustration evident. Greg's gaze darkened. "We go where he goes. We find out who he's working with, who's protecting him, and we expose them." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. This was becoming more dangerous than he had anticipated. But he couldn't back down now, not when they were so close to uncovering the truth. "Let's do it," he said, his voice firm. "Whatever it takes." Sarah nodded, and for the first time since they had started this journey, there was a flicker of hope in her eyes. They were getting closer. But as Ethan looked around the dimly lit coffee shop, a cold realization settled over him. They weren't just chasing shadows anymore. The shadows were watching them too. The city lights flickered outside the window of Ethan's apartment as he sat at his desk, staring blankly at the screen. The glow of his computer monitor illuminated the dark room, casting long shadows on the walls. Greg's words from the meeting echoed in his mind. "We need evidence." Ethan had been restless ever since they left the coffee shop. The realization of how deep and twisted this web went gnawed at him. David Hawthorne wasn't just a counselor. He was a gatekeeper to something darker, something that preyed on people like Oliver. And now Ethan had a decision to make. He could keep digging, keep pushing until the truth came out, or he could walk away, let the darkness remain in the shadows. But walking away wasn't an option anymore. A soft knock on his door broke the silence. He turned to see Sarah standing in the doorway, her face partially hidden in the dim light. She looked as tired as he felt, her eyes hollow, her shoulders weighed down by the burden of everything they had uncovered. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, neither saying a word. There was an understanding between them now, a shared determination that neither had to voice. "Can't sleep either?" Sarah asked, her voice soft but carrying the weight of unspoken emotions. Ethan shook his head. "Too much on my mind." He glanced at the screen again, the endless documents and research files cluttering his desktop. "It feels like the more we find out, the further away we get from any real answers." Sarah stepped into the room, leaning against the wall, her arms crossed. "That's how it always is. The deeper you go, the darker it gets. But we're getting closer. I can feel it." Ethan let out a heavy sigh, running a hand through his hair. "Closer to what? What if this isn't just about Oliver? What if there's something bigger here, something that's been going on for years?" Sarah's eyes darkened at his words. "Then we bring it all down, no matter how long it's been happening." She paused, glancing toward the window, her voice quieter when she spoke again. "Oliver wouldn't want us to stop." The mention of his brother sent a familiar ache through Ethan's chest. He leaned back in his chair, staring up at the ceiling, memories flooding his mind. Oliver had always been the bright one, the one who could find the light in any situation, even when things were falling apart. Ethan had always admired that about him. He never thought Oliver would be the one to slip into the darkness, to get lost in something he couldn't escape from. He never talked about it, Ethan muttered, his voice rough. The addiction, I mean, he kept it all hidden. I didn't even know how bad it was until it was too late. Sarah's gaze softened, her own memories surfacing. That's how it goes for most of us. You hide it because you're ashamed. You don't want to be seen as weak, as broken. She looked down at the floor, her fingers absent-mindedly playing with the hem of her sleeve. He was a lot like me in that way. Ethan looked at her, surprised by the vulnerability in her voice. Over the past few days, he had begun to see glimpses of the real Sarah beneath the guarded exterior. The girl who had once been lost, just like Oliver. He could see now how much his brother had meant to her, how deeply their paths had intertwined, even if they hadn't known each other for long. I didn't know, Ethan admitted, his voice softer now. I didn't know how much he was hurting, and I hate myself for it. I should have seen the signs. I should have been there. Sarah stepped closer, her eyes meeting his. It's not your fault, Ethan. You couldn't have known. Addiction doesn't show itself the way you think it will. It hides. It tricks people into thinking they're fine when they're not. She paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. Oliver, he didn't want you to know. He didn't want anyone to know. Ethan's jaw clenched as the guilt he had been carrying for months resurfaced. But I should have done something. I should have tried harder. You did what you could, Sarah said gently. We all did. For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of their shared grief hanging between them. Sarah stepped closer, her voice quiet but firm. He saved me, Ethan. You know that, right? If it weren't for Oliver, I wouldn't be here right now. I wouldn't have had the strength to keep going. Ethan looked up, meeting her gaze. The sincerity in her eyes hit him hard. He had always known his brother had a good heart, but hearing how much of an impact Oliver had made on Sarah's life brought a new kind of pain, one that was mixed with pride and sorrow. Tell me about him, Ethan said suddenly, surprising even himself. Tell me what he was like in the group. I need to know. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then nodded, taking a seat on the edge of his desk. He was quiet, at first, kept to himself, like a lot of us did. But when he spoke, everyone listened. He had this way of making you feel like you weren't alone, like he understood what you were going through without even saying it. I think that's why so many people gravitated toward him. Ethan listened, a tightness in his chest as Sarah spoke. This was a side of Oliver he had never known, a version of his brother that had existed outside of their shared history. And yet, it felt so familiar. It made sense that Oliver had become a light for others, even as his own light was dimming. He wasn't perfect, Sarah continued, her voice growing softer. He had his own demons. We all do. But he was trying, Ethan. He was really trying. And that's what makes this so hard. He didn't deserve what happened to him. Ethan swallowed hard, the knot in his throat tightening. None of them did. Sarah nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. That's why we have to keep going. For Oliver. For all of them. Ethan stood up, pacing the room as the weight of everything settled on his shoulders. They were getting closer to the truth, but the closer they got, the more dangerous it became. David Hawthorne, the rehab industry, the people pulling the strings behind the scenes, they weren't just dealing with addiction. They were dealing with a system that preyed on vulnerability, on the broken and the lost. How do we fight this? Ethan asked, his voice tight. How do we take on something this big? Sarah stood up, her gaze steady. One step at a time. We start by finding the people who know the truth. We get the evidence, and we expose them. Ethan nodded, his resolve hardening. He was tired of running, tired of hiding from the pain. This wasn't just about Oliver anymore. It was about stopping whatever machine had taken him away and making sure it didn't take anyone else. Tomorrow, Ethan said, his voice firm, we go after Hawthorne. We find out who he's working for. Sarah's expression mirrored his determination. And we don't stop until we get the truth. As they stood there, side by side in the dim light of the room, Ethan felt something shift inside him. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. A step toward healing, toward finding some kind of peace, not just for himself, but for Oliver too. And as they faced the dark road ahead, Ethan knew that whatever happened next, they were in it together. The next morning arrived with a chilling sense of purpose. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, the silence between him and Sarah thick with the weight of what lay ahead. The sunlight filtered weakly through the large windows, casting long shadows across the room, but neither of them seemed to notice. They had stayed up late, strategizing, digging deeper into the web of connections surrounding David Hawthorne, the man they believed held the key to understanding Oliver's death. The plan was set, but there was an underlying tension that neither of them could shake. Ethan glanced at Sarah, who sat across from him, staring at the same cup of coffee she had been nursing for nearly an hour. She was deep in thought, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the rim of the cup, her mind clearly somewhere far away. "We're going to do this today," Ethan said, breaking the silence. His voice was low, but there was a conviction behind it that hadn't been there before. "We're going to find him. We're going to get the truth." Sarah looked up at him, her expression unreadable. She nodded, but Ethan could sense something else lingering behind her eyes. Fear, doubt, maybe even regret. He understood. They were standing on the edge of something dark and dangerous, and once they crossed that line, there would be no going back. "You don't have to do this, you know," Ethan added softly. "You can walk away now, and no one would blame you." Sarah's eyes narrowed, and she shook her head, a spark of determination flaring up in her expression. "I'm not walking away. Not now. Not after everything." Ethan nodded, feeling a strange sense of relief at her words. He didn't want to do this alone. The truth was, Sarah had become more than just an ally in this fight. Over the past few days, he had come to realize just how much she had been through, how much she had lost, just like him. They were both haunted by ghosts, both trying to outrun their demons. But here, in this moment, they had a chance to fight back. Together. "I don't know what we're going to find," Sarah admitted, her voice softening, "but we have to try. For Oliver. For all of them." Ethan's chest tightened at the mention of his brother. He took a deep breath, pushing down the familiar ache that rose up every time Oliver's name was spoken aloud. He didn't need to say anything in response. Sarah understood. She always did. They spent the afternoon preparing, gathering the pieces of evidence they had uncovered so far. Ethan's laptop was filled with files, photos, and transcripts of conversations that painted a picture of corruption and exploitation in the recovery industry. David Hawthorne was at the center of it all, a puppet master who had profited off the suffering of people like Oliver, and Ethan was ready to bring him down. By late afternoon, they had everything they needed. They were ready to confront Hawthorne. The plan was simple: find him, ask questions, and get whatever information they could. Greg had given them a lead on his location. A private rehab center on the outskirts of the city, one that had connections to the string of overdoses they had been tracking. Ethan's grip tightened on the steering wheel as they drove toward the rehab center, the city skyline disappearing behind them as they entered the more isolated, wooded area outside of town. Sarah sat beside him, her body tense, her hands resting in her lap as she stared out the window. Neither of them spoke, but the tension was palpable. As they approached the facility, Ethan's mind raced with the possibilities. What if they were wrong? What if this wasn't the place where they would find answers? And what if they were right? What if Hawthorne was responsible for more than just Oliver's death? The thought sent a chill down his spine. "We need to be careful," Sarah said quietly, breaking the silence. "We can't go in there guns blazing. If he's involved in something this big, he'll have people protecting him." Ethan nodded, his jaw clenched. "We'll get what we need, then we'll get out. No risks." They pulled into the gravel lot outside the facility, their eyes scanning the building in front of them. It was sleek and modern, far too polished to be a place where people went to heal. The facade was a lie, just like everything else they had uncovered about the industry. As they stepped out of the car, the cool evening air hit them, adding to the tension that was already thick in the atmosphere. Ethan glanced at Sarah, who gave him a brief nod before they made their way toward the entrance. They didn't know what they would find inside, but they were ready for whatever came next. Inside, the rehab center was eerily quiet. The receptionist gave them a polite smile as they signed in, clearly unaware of their true intentions. They followed the directions they had been given, winding through long hallways lined with sterile white walls, until they reached Hawthorne's office. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he knocked on the door. Moments later, it swung open, revealing a man in his mid-50s, his face calm, his eyes sharp. David Hawthorne, the man who held the answers to everything. "Mr. Price, I presume?" Hawthorne greeted him with a warm smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I've been expecting you." Ethan froze. He exchanged a quick glance with Sarah, who looked equally caught off guard. How did Hawthorne know they were coming? Had someone tipped him off? "Please, come in," Hawthorne continued, gesturing toward the office behind him. "I assume you're here to talk about your brother." The mention of Oliver's name sent a wave of anger through Ethan, but he forced himself to stay calm. They had come this far. Now it was time to get the truth. They stepped into the office, the door clicking shut behind them. Hawthorne walked around his desk, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were in complete control of the situation. "I know why you're here," Hawthorne said, settling into his chair. "And I understand your grief, but I'm afraid there's nothing I can do for you." Ethan's hands clenched into fists. "You don't get to say that. You know exactly what happened to my brother. And to the others. We're not leaving until we get answers." Hawthorne's smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating expression. "You have no idea what you're getting yourselves into. This isn't about your brother anymore. This is bigger than you can imagine." Sarah stepped forward, her voice steady but laced with fury. "We don't care how big it is. We're going to expose everything." Hawthorne's gaze shifted to her, his eyes narrowing. "Expose what, exactly? That people like your brother couldn't be saved? That addiction claims lives, no matter how hard you try." Ethan's blood boiled. "This isn't about addiction. This is about you using people like Oliver for profit. You're a parasite, feeding off the vulnerable." Hawthorne's expression darkened, but there was no fear in his eyes. "I provide a service. I give people hope. If they can't handle it, that's on them." Ethan felt the room closing in around him, the weight of everything they had uncovered pressing down on him. This man, this monster, had been responsible for so much suffering, and yet he sat there, calm, unbothered. "People are dead because of you," Ethan spat, his voice shaking with rage. "Including my brother." Hawthorne leaned back in his chair, his eyes cold and unfeeling. "People die every day. Some because of their own choices, others because of circumstances beyond their control. What happened to your brother was unfortunate, but it was inevitable." Ethan's vision blurred with anger. He took a step forward, but Sarah's hand on his arm stopped him. She shook her head, silently telling him to stay calm. "We'll get the truth," Sarah said, her voice steady. "One way or another." Hawthorne smirked, leaning forward. "Good luck with that." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as they left the office, the door slamming shut behind them. The encounter had been short, but it was enough to confirm what they already knew. Hawthorne was guilty. But the cold realization settled over them both. They were dealing with something far bigger than they had anticipated. As they stepped outside, the cool night air hit them again, but this time, it felt like a weight pressing down on their shoulders. The road ahead was dark and dangerous, but they were more determined than ever. They had made a pact. Together, they would bring this corruption to light. And no matter what it took, they wouldn't stop until the truth was revealed. Ethan sat in the darkness of his apartment, staring at the files strewn across the table. His mind raced as the events of the day replayed in his head, each moment sharper, clearer. The encounter with Hawthorne had rattled him. The man had been so calm, so certain that they couldn't touch him. His words had been cold, calculating, like he knew Ethan and Sarah were outmatched, that they couldn't bring him down. And maybe Hawthorne was right. The enormity of what they were facing hit Ethan with full force. It wasn't just about Oliver anymore. It wasn't even just about Hawthorne. It was about the entire system. Rehab facilities, recovery programs, and the people profiting from them while the vulnerable fell through the cracks. How could two people, no matter how determined, take on something so vast and corrupt? Ethan's phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a message from Greg, the journalist. Ethan opened it, his eyes scanning the brief but urgent text. "Got something. Meet me tonight. It's big." Ethan felt his pulse quicken. This was it, the break they had been waiting for. He stood up, grabbing his jacket as he made his way to the door. But as he stepped out into the hallway, a cold sense of unease washed over him. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Ever since the meeting with Hawthorne, it had felt like there were eyes on them, like they had crossed a line they couldn't come back from. Sarah was waiting by the elevator, her expression as tense as his. She had seen the message too. Without a word, they stepped inside the elevator, the silence between them filled with the weight of anticipation. Greg's meeting point was a deserted parking lot near an abandoned industrial building on the outskirts of the city. The kind of place where shadows stretched long, and the only sounds were the distant hum of the highway. As they pulled in, Ethan scanned the area, his nerves on edge. Greg was leaning against his car, a cigarette dangling from his lips, his eyes flicking toward them as they stepped out of the car. "You weren't followed, were you?" Greg asked, his voice low. Ethan shook his head. "No, we're clear. What did you find?" Greg took a deep drag of his cigarette, exhaling slowly as he reached into his jacket. He pulled out a small flash drive and handed it to Ethan. "This," Greg said, his voice tight. "I found a paper trail. Financial records, off-the-books payments to people connected to the rehab industry. Hawthorne's been funneling money for years, paying off officials, burying complaints. It's all there. Proof that he's been covering up deaths, manipulating recovery programs to keep people hooked on the system. And your brother? He wasn't an accident. They knew he was asking questions, and they made sure he didn't get the chance to expose them." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he took the flash drive. It felt heavier than it should, like it contained the weight of everything they had been fighting for. Proof. This was the key to bringing Hawthorne down, to exposing the rot that had taken Oliver's life and countless others. "We can take this to the authorities," Ethan said, his voice filled with a new sense of hope. "They can't ignore this." Greg's expression darkened. "You don't understand. This goes deeper than just Hawthorne. There are people, powerful people, who will do anything to protect this. If you go public with this, you're putting a target on your back. On both of your backs." Ethan glanced at Sarah, whose eyes were locked on Greg. She wasn't afraid. She was angry. "We don't have a choice," Sarah said, her voice steady. "We're not backing down. Not after everything." Greg looked between them, a flicker of respect crossing his face. "Then you'd better be ready for what's coming. Because once this gets out, there's no turning back." Ethan nodded, feeling the weight of Greg's words settle over him like a cloud. He knew they were walking into dangerous territory. But this was for Oliver. For all the people who had been failed by the system, by the people who were supposed to help them. "Let's finish this," Ethan said quietly, his voice filled with determination. Ethan and Sarah sat in front of Greg's computer, the screen flickering with data as the files from the flash drive loaded. The evidence was overwhelming. Payments, falsified records, lists of patients who had mysteriously disappeared from the system. It was all there, laid out in cold, hard numbers. Hawthorne had built an empire on the suffering of others, and now they had the power to tear it down. "We need to go public," Sarah said, her voice firm. "The media, the authorities, everyone needs to see this." Ethan nodded, though the weight of what they were about to do pressed heavily on his chest. "We need to be smart about this. If we just hand this over, they'll try to bury it. We need to make it impossible for them to ignore." Greg leaned forward, his eyes intense. "I can help with that. I'll reach out to my contacts, get this to the right people. But once this goes live, you need to be ready. Hawthorne won't go down quietly, and neither will the people protecting him." Ethan exchanged a glance with Sarah. They both knew what was at stake, but there was no hesitation in her eyes. She was ready. They both were. "Do it," Ethan said, his voice steady. "We're ready." Greg nodded, turning back to his computer. Within minutes, the files were uploaded, sent to multiple outlets, ensuring that the information couldn't be silenced. It was out there now, beyond their control. The truth had been unleashed, and there was no going back. As they stepped out of Greg's office, the weight of everything they had done began to settle over Ethan. He had spent so long searching for answers, for closure, and now that they had the truth, it felt both liberating and terrifying. He didn't know what would happen next, whether they would be hailed as heroes or hunted by the people they had exposed. But it didn't matter anymore. Oliver's death hadn't been in vain. They had done what he couldn't, and now it was up to the world to decide what to do with the truth. "Ethan," Sarah's voice broke through his thoughts, and he turned to face her. She was standing a few feet away, her expression softer than he had ever seen it. "Thank you. For everything." Ethan shook his head. "No, thank you. I couldn't have done this without you." They stood in silence for a moment, the gravity of their journey weighing heavy between them. There was a shared understanding now, a bond forged through loss, pain, and a fight for justice that neither of them had expected. "So what now?" Sarah asked, a hint of uncertainty in her voice. Ethan looked out at the horizon. The city stretched out before them, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. He didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he could breathe again. "Now," Ethan said, his voice quiet but sure. "Now we start over." Sarah smiled, a small, hopeful smile that carried the promise of something better. They had been through hell, but they had come out the other side stronger. And whatever came next, they would face it together. As they walked away from Greg's office, side by side, the weight of the past began to lift. The truth was out, and their future, uncertain as it was finally their own. We hope you were moved and inspired by our story. We want to hear your opinion. Leave a comment below, share your impressions, and your own stories of resilience and hope. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our next emotional videos. Join us on this journey and follow more incredible stories. See you next time.